Guten Morgen oder Mahlzeit, je nachdem, wie
Microphone
früh
is
Sie
on. Okay,
aufgestanden
good
sind.
morning.
Mein Name ist Viviane
Or hello,
Handler-Kunze.
my name is Viviane
Ich
Handler-Kunze.
bin hier als Vertreterin von der Firma
I
Pfeiffer Consulting
represent
und
Pfeiffer
möchte Ihnen heute
Consulting
ein
at
bisschen
this
nahebringen,
event, and I
womit
would
wir in der
like
Zukunft
to
in der
show you a
Kosmetik
little
zu
bit
rechnen haben.
what we're going to have to
Bei manchen
expect in the world of
Themen
cosmetics in the
ist es schon
future.
möglich, dass man sehr
So
konkrete
for
Aussagen
some
trifft, was
topics, it's
verboten
possible
werden wird
to
und was
say,
nicht.
make
Bei
very
manchen
concrete
anderen
predictions
Themen
about what's going to be prohibited.
haben wir noch ein bisschen die Kristallkugel
With other
und man weiß
topics,
noch nicht
it's
so
still
recht,
a
in
bit of a
welche Richtung sich
crystal
das
ball
Thema
kind of
entwickeln
thing,
wird.
and we're not quite sure where we're
Ganz kurz
going,
möchte ich
where
Ihnen
things
die
will be
Firma
going.
Pfeiffer Consulting
Let me
vorstellen.
just start quickly
Das
by
Kernteam besteht
introducing
natürlich
the
aus dem Herrn
Pfeiffer
Pfeiffer
company. So the
selber,
core team is Mr.
der
Pfeiffer
den Betrieb
himself, of
aufgebaut
course,
hat.
who
Seine
built up the
Steckenpferde
company.
sind der komplette Beratungsbereich,
He's all about
Auditierung,
consulting, orientation, GMB,
Produktion.
quality,
Dann gibt es
production.
dazu noch die Frau Dr. Brüsch,
Then
die
there's
auch sehr viel
also Dr.
auditiert.
Brüsch, who also does a lot
Seit
of
circa ein bisschen mehr
auditing.
wie einem Jahr haben wir noch einen
For
Sicherheitsbewerter
about
im
a year, we
Team,
also have a
den Herrn
safety
Dr.
assessor in
Bernhard
our
Smutek.
team, Dr.
Und
Bernhard
dann
Mutek.
gibt es eine Reihe von
And
Personen, so
then
wie mich,
there's a
die
number of
im
people, such
Netzwerk
as myself,
mitarbeiten
who
und für
work
einzelne
in the
Fragestellungen dann
network
herangezogen werden.
and are consulted in specific
Mein
areas.
Steckenpferd ist, wie Sie auch an dem
So
Vortrag
my
auch erkennen
specialty, as you
können,
can see in
das
the
Thema
title of the
Regulatory.
presentation,
Also
is
ich
regulatory
beschäftige mich sehr viel
affairs.
mit der
So
Kosmetikverordnung,
I look very
Produktinformationsdatei,
closely at the
Kennzeichnungen
cosmetic products
und bei mir landen
regulation,
dann zumeist
labeling
eben die
regulations, etc.
Fragestellungen, wenn es
And
darum geht,
usually
wie
I
schaut es
deal
aus
with
mit dem Stoff, kann ich
questions
den in Zukunft
dealing
einsetzen
with,
oder
well,
nicht.
can I use this substance in the future or not?
Danke.
Oh, thank you.
Beziehungsweise, wenn Sie eine
Or
Rezeptur haben, ob
when you
diese
have a
verkehrsfähig
formulation,
ist oder
whether it's actually
Das
marketable or
Unternehmen
not.
kann inzwischen 25
The
Jahre Erfahrung
company by
aufweisen
now has 25
auf den
years of
verschiedensten
experience
Gebieten
in various areas of
und wir sind
expertise.
auch an 3 Standorten
And we
vertreten.
also have
Einerseits
3
hier in Deutschland,
offices. One is in Germany,
andererseits in Bonita
then there
Springs
is
in
in
den
one
USA
in
und es gibt
Bonita
noch eine
Springs in the
Dependance
US,
in
and there's
Bulgarien.
another branch
Hier
office
noch
in
eine kurze
Bulgaria.
Auflistung, wo unsere Kunden
This
zu finden
is
sind,
a
dass Sie
list
sehen,
of
das ist
where
sehr
our clients are
international
to be found, so you
aufgestellt.
can see it's very international.
So, bevor wir jetzt
So
tatsächlich in das Thema
before we
einsteigen,
actually delve into
machen
the
wir eine
topic,
kleine
let's
Zeitreise in die
travel
Vergangenheit.
back in time for a bit.
Und zwar in das
So
Zeitalter
this
vor
is the age
2009.
before
Sie werden sich
2009.
vielleicht noch erinnern,
So you
damals
may
gab es die
remember back then, we
Kosmetikrichtlinie,
had
die
the
für uns
Cosmetics
galt, die
Directive,
dann in
which
das
was
jeweilige
applicable to
nationale
us,
Recht
which
umgesetzt
then had
werden
to be
musste.
implemented in respective
Dazu
national
noch ein paar
legislation.
horizontale
Then a few
Gesetzgebungen, die eben nicht
horizontal
nur auf
laws,
Kosmetik zutreffen,
which did not apply
sondern
only
auch
to
auf andere
cosmetics, but
Produktgruppen.
also to
Das
other
waren das
product groups,
Produktsicherheitsgesetz,
such as the Product Safety Act, the Ordinance on Pre-Packaging,
und zu
the
diesem
Aerosol
Zeitpunkt gab's
Packaging
auch
Ordinance,
schon die
and at that
ersten
time,
Beginne von
there were also
REACH
the
und von der
beginnings of
CLP-Verordnung.
REACH and
Also
the
das ganze
CLP
Thema
regulation.
Chemikalienrecht
So this
wurde
entire
damals
topic
neu
of
aufgestellt
chemicals was
innerhalb der EU.
restructured back then in the
Und
EU.
ja, zu diesem Zeitpunkt
So
galten
at
diese
that
Verordnungen
time,
zwar
these
schon,
regulations
hatten aber
were
noch bei
already in
weitem
effect,
nicht
but
diesen Einfluss auf das
they
Kosmetikrecht,
did not
den wir
have
jetzt haben.
the kind of
Was
impact on
damals schon
cosmetics
war,
they're
ist
having
eben, dass
right now.
natürlich der Konsumentenschutz
So back then, of course, consumer
sehr wichtig war
protection
für die
was already
Gesetzgeber
very
und für den
important in
Gesetzgeber.
legislation and
Und
for
damals war es
legislators.
eben so formuliert
And back
von der
then,
Gesetzgebung
the
her,
phrasing was
dass
also in legislation
ein kosmetisches Mittel
that a
bei
cosmetic
normaler oder
product
vernünftigerweise vorhersehbarer Verwendung die menschliche Gesundheit nicht gefährden darf, nicht schädigen darf.
must
Das
not
heißt,
damage
dieser
human
Passus
health when
war so
used
formuliert,
reasonably
dass im
or under reasonably
Zweifelsfall
foreseeable
bei Bedenken
conditions of
die
use.
Behörden
So
den
in
Betrieben
case of
nachweisen
doubt,
mussten, dass
the
tatsächlich
authorities
das
had to
den
prove
Konsumenten
to the
schädigt.
companies that their product was actually unsafe for human
Ja, wie
health.
schaut es jetzt aus? Sie
So,
sehen schon
what's the
anhand der
situation
Folie,
now?
es hat sich hier viel
So you can
getan.
see on the slide a
Wir
lot has
sind
happened.
umgestiegen von der
So the
Kosmetikverordnung,
Cosmetics
von der Kosmetikrichtlinie
Directive
auf die
became
Kosmetikverordnung,
the
die
Cosmetics
jetzt in
Products
allen
Regulation,
EU-Staaten unmittelbar
which
gültig ist.
is now immediately
Von den
effective in all
horizontalen
EU countries. The
Verordnungen gibt's
horizontal
eben jetzt noch die
regulations have
Explosivstoffverordnung,
been
zu der kommen wir
complemented by
später
the
noch.
regulation on
Und
explosives, which we're going to talk about later. And then, of course, labeling of packaging.
Ja, und Sie sehen schon an den Feldern, also REACH und CLP,
and you see REACH and CLP have much more impact and influence than they used to. The reason is that they're currently being reassessed, new data becomes available, new data is being included, and this will also be assessed in a cosmetics context. So if you asked me what was the greatest impact when we changed from the directive to the regulation, I would answer there are 2 points. One point is the implementation of this term of the responsible person, which prevents various actors from putting the responsibility on somebody else, and you have a fixed point of contact, which is the responsible person. And the second point is that the definition has been changed. It means, because the definition now says that the product must be safe for human health. So at first glance, you would say it's the same definition as it was in the directive, but this phrasing switches the burden of proof and flips it on its head. So now it's not a to-do for the authority to prove that your product is unsafe, but you have to prove that your product is safe. Means to prove that is labeling, instructions for use, but of course, above all, the safety assessment. So there was a paradigm change. And now it is up to you, when you use new ingredients, it's up to you to think about those really clearly, to consider how are they composed, are there any pollutions, are they of the same quality and of a consistent quality, which is a challenge with plant-based raw materials, of course. And something that's important for the safety assessor is, are there any toxicity data on that ingredient for a toxicology assessment in order to have that as part of the safety assessment, or are there any gaps in the toxicology data, in the tox data? So when you don't have that information on your raw materials, and if there are gaps in the tox data, that will mean that you cannot prove the safety of your product. And that means automatically that you cannot market your product. You're not allowed to launch that product. So, no data, no market. If you can't prove the safety of your product, you cannot market it. Now, cosmetics regulations and legislation is subject to adaptation to the state of the art from various corners. So on the one hand, from chemicals legislation, and on the other hand, for instance, opinions by the SCCS, which is the Scientific Committee on Consumer Safety. So this is a body which regularly conducts tox assessments of substances. And depending on what this data from chemicals legislation and CCS opinions, depending on what that data results in, it can be positive, so the positive can be rated safe, or it can be negative, meaning, so for instance, if the SCCS concludes that the product is unsafe, or it can be found that there is no sufficient data in order to assess the product safety. So in those cases, the next step is prohibiting that ingredient. And now the question is whether there is an interest on the part of the industry to defend that ingredient, whether there is sufficient financial capacity to defend that ingredient, because of course that requires additional testing, which costs a lot of money. And then it's still not sure what these tests will result in, whether the test results will actually say, oh yes, that gap can be closed, this data gap, or whether the tests say, well, bummer, the test still shows that there are toxicological problems. So no matter what happens, it will be reflected in draft legislation at some point. So it can either be aimed towards explicitly allowing or explicitly forbidding that ingredient. So the process is like with any other law. It's being voted on, and then it's passed and published as a bill. So now I would like to touch upon a few topics where there have been adaptations in the last few years, or where there will be adaptations. So one topic is CMRs. So CMRs are substances which are rated as cancerogenic, mutagenic, or reprotoxic under REACH or CLP. And the topic here is that in the cosmetic products regulation, it says explicitly that these substances cannot be used, that they are prohibited unless one of these exceptions applies. So category 2, this means it is only a suspected CMR substance, so it is prohibited unless the scientific committee publishes an opinion saying, well, under these circumstances, the product can be rated safe. And for category 1A and 1B, the prerequisites are much stricter. Well, you can see this is colored in red, there's a lot happening. So this is a list of substances which were reassessed recently. All of these are substances where the cosmetics industry either has no interest in defending them, or they found that it makes no sense to keep defending these ingredients because there are alternatives anyway. So the case here is that the prohibition is not yet laid down in law, but will probably become effective in the foreseeable future. So we're talking in the course of the next year, probably. So the next topic. Unter endokrin wirkend versteht man mal per se, dass dieser Stoff is endocrine substances. So what this means is that the substances have an impact on the human hormone system. So we have to differentiate between a hormonal effect and a disruptive effect. So the difficult topic is the consumer perception, because consumers don't differentiate. So you can see I pulled the information from various websites. They're actually conducting aggressive ad campaigns, saying that a substance does not have any ingredients with a hormonal effect. Whether that is actually clear or not, I don't think that's okay. But there are other people and other opinions which actually allow for that. So these are two lists of substances which were assessed in the first step. So you can see quite a list of products. And this is the current situation. So the substances highlighted in red are definitely going to be prohibited. For some, a prohibition is actually already in place, like butaphonyl methylpropanol. And for the other substances highlighted in red, the bills are already lined up. So the substances still written in black on the slide, there are already some assessments which are positive. But there will still be changes, for instance, by reducing the concentration to be used to something. Now, nanomaterial is another very interesting topic. So 5 or 6 years ago, it was much more of a hot topic. So nanomaterial is a non-soluble or biologically persistent, purposefully produced material where a single unit or its inner structure is sized in at least one dimension between 1 and 100 nanometers. So this is the definition from the Cosmetic Products Regulation. Some nanomaterials have already been assessed and included in the annexes of the Cosmetic Products Regulation. For instance, carbon black, the UV filter, titanium dioxide, zinc oxide. So these are the common nanomaterials, but there are some other nanomaterials which are currently in the process of having opinions created about them. So hydroxyapatite is very important. It's being used in toothpaste, and a dossier was submitted on silica. So right now we don't know what the assessment is going to be. So if you use these materials, you should keep an eye on developments to make sure you don't end up in a situation where you're using the substance and then all of a sudden it is prohibited. Here's another UV filter, which is on the brink of being allowed. So there was an assessment that was basically okay. Again, however, this is restricted to a certain concentration in use. And like most nanomaterials, intake by inhalation is critical for humans, which is why these ingredients are excluded for any inhalation. So all spray applications are not allowed for that material. And now there's a list of substances which have been assessed, but negatively, meaning that the SCCS found that there is no sufficient data to prove the material is safe or to rate it safe, assess it as safe. So we can expect these substances to be forbidden, to be prohibited. Another topic which has been at the back of our minds for a while, where we as an industry have been waiting for regulation for a while, is fragrance allergens. So back in 2011, the SCCS has published an opinion on fragrance allergens. This included a lot of fragrances, and one conclusion was a mandatory labeling of and to expand that, to apply that duty to 88 fragrances rather than the 26 that were currently under a declarative duty. Yeah, this was the INCI list, probably you want to show, yeah? Yes, there are talks for digital solutions, where as a consumer you can scan a QR code in order to obtain a list of the fragrance allergens. Right now, I'm sorry, I cannot tell you what will be decided ultimately. I am assuming that there will be a change. And I'm looking into my crystal ball right now. So this is my prediction, my forecast. I think this change will have quite an impact on us. However, it makes no sense to keep ruminating on that right now because there's no decision right now. So in parallel, there are other ongoing assessments for benzyl salicylate and citrol. So benzyl salicylate is one of those substances which is a suspected endocrine disruptor. So one more topic which has been kind of gotten swept under the rug, it's almost old hat. The European Commission in 2002 published a hair dye strategy with the goal of assessing all the available hair dyes, because back then there was suspicion of oxidative hair dye could cause cancer of the bladder. So we're talking about 300 different substances which must be assessed. Right now there's sodium bromothiol blue which is being assessed, and the goal is, the objective is that all these oxidative hair dyes will be included in Annex 4, which is the list of allowed colorants, which means in reverse that all hair dyes that are not included in this list will be automatically prohibited. So that is a process that is ongoing at the moment. Hair dyes are being continuously assessed. Right now, they're still included in Annex 3, and at some point they'll be included in Annex 4, effectively excluding all other dyes. So I cannot give you any indication of the timing of that. The last thing I heard about that was, well, 4.5 years ago, and it said in the next 6 months there's going to be something. So you can see, it's not always that easy to get reliable forecasts. This is also a topic which will give us a lot of food for thought, which is the European Green Deal. So this is an EU concept published under President Ursula von der Leyen, and the goal of that Green Deal is for the EU to achieve climate neutrality by 2050 and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by the year 2030. Whether these are realistic goals or not is a different thing, it's a different story. But there will be a plethora of measures there has already been. So from energy and traffic to industry, the points that are relevant or most relevant for us will be biodiversity. So they're trying to make sure to maintain biodiversity, the ethical sourcing of resources, and the last point, which is the assessment of raw material as to their environmental friendliness, which happens via chemicals legislation, and then of course create regulations and create rules that govern the use of those substances. This would include, for example, microplastics. So I'm always asking myself, when I look into such a topic, what's the definition of that topic, of that term? So for microplastics, there is a bunch of very different definitions. I just selected 3. I don't want to torment you with the definition. I just want to illustrate how different these definitions are. But one thing they all have in common is that we're talking about particles of a size of less than 5 millimeters, which are made of plastic or polymer. And most definitions also include that they're not easily biodegradable. So, depending on the definition, there are differences between material, shape, maximum, minimum size, solubility, and degradability. So, at the moment, this is a topic that's very hard to grasp for me personally, because it is really difficult to see, am I actually talking about microplastics or not? It's even harder to find out for consumers. And this takes us back to consumer inquiries, because just based on the INCI list, they believe they're able to tell whether a product contains microplastics or not. Well, you are all experts here. I'm sure it's very clear to you that an inky term cannot tell you whether the product contains microplastic or not. Fact is that the cosmetics industry, on its own accord, has drastically reduced the use of microplastics. So there is a restriction suggestion proposed by ECHA, which is about a prohibition of products containing 0.001% microplastics for rinse-off products from 2026 onwards. So this is quite a long period of time that's envisioned. This is supposed to give you an idea that it's still a very vague thing. The second prohibition would apply to leave-on products, so all products that remain on the skin. And I'm asking myself, to what extent a prohibition actually makes sense here? Because leave-on products are classically applied or taken off by a cotton ball and then which is then put into the trash. So usually those products don't enter the water cycle. Okay, now microplastics, we're still with polymers. But let's now talk about a few rules. This is a directive supposed to prevent polymer products from getting into the environment. This is not just for cosmetics. This also applies to one-use plastics products like straws, mugs, hygiene products, cigarette filters, etc. So it's interdisciplinary. The most relevant for us are wet wipes. So if you have wet wipes or wet cloths where you have fleece based on polymer, this means that you have to apply this label. It's been mandatory since July last year. I think most of you have seen this somewhere. Well, so we're not just impacted by chemicals legislation or environmental legislation, but also by food legislation. So we can see this with titanium dioxide, which was reassessed by the EFSA recently, and EFSA found that this substance is unsafe as a food additive because there are concerns as to the genotoxicity. As you know, this is a raw material which you use in cosmetics as well. So the topic is, of course, when I have a substance which is declared as unsafe for food, when I can use it in an oral application because the body will still intake it. So the SCCS is currently tasked with conducting a reassessment whether the application in a lipstick, for example, would be relevant or not. Now, this is a topic which which gives me the most headache, not so much because of the formulations, but more because of the marking of products. Because what I'm seeing is a development towards national legislation where every country has its own marking and labeling regulations. So this is the Triman logo for France. So this means if you export or planning to export products to France, you need to make sure they bear this marking. So these are instructions on how to dispose of the packaging material. Another regulation which made quite a fuss at first was the regulation on explosives. So in that case, that is a regulation which has no impact on marking or formulation. but it applies to chemicals which are easily accessible and which can be used to produce explosives or which may be used for that. So for us, hydrogen peroxide and acetone are most relevant, and the regulation on explosives dictates that you as a company need to report it if, for instance, you find that a large quantity of acetone has been stolen from your warehouse or has disappeared from your stocks, or if a customer buys great quantities of maybe nail polish remover and even wants to pay in cash for that. So you need to report that. So I'm imagining people queuing at the cash points at the drugstore at DM and Rossmann, and the cashier must decide whether this is a suspicious transaction or not. So sometimes I'm actually glad I don't work in retail and I don't have to worry about that. So, last topic, the Act on Corporate Due Diligence Obligations in Supply Chains. This is a law that will be implemented in Germany in the first step. So what is this about? It's about making sure that companies take their supply chains into consideration and think about them more. So what about human rights? What about the environment? As a company, you have to make sure you build a legally sound supply chain. You have to make risk analysis, have preventative measures defined, and document all that accordingly. So, well, to relieve you of your worries, you can see the transitionary period. So in the first step, this applies to really, really big companies like 3,000 plus employees. In the second step, companies with 1,000 employees. Whether it'll be broken down to even smaller companies is nothing I can tell you. I don't know. Well, you've seen a bouquet of new legal topics showering down on us, raining down on us. I hope I did not make your heart rate go up when you have some prohibited ingredients in your formulation. If you do, please take care of it as fast as you can. I think you also took away from this presentation that other legislation increasingly impacts cosmetics legislation. So you don't just have to keep an eye on the cosmetic products regulation. Particularly in packaging, there's this development toward national labeling and marking solutions where I as a company have to define exactly which articles, which items are exported where, what marking do I have to put there for which country. And of course, the whole topic of sustainability is something that we need to keep on our radars, even more so in the future. And in conclusion, no matter what changes we talk about, we must keep track of these developments, and as companies, we must implement them in time and on time in order to make sure we can still launch and market our products. So if you have any questions, feel free to visit us. We're in Hall 3 at booth 17. You will find the entire team here, Ms. Pfeiffer, Mr. Brüsch, Mr. Smutig, and myself. And feel free to bombard us with your questions anytime. Thank you.